The Biscari Massacre, July 14, 1943, Sicily, World War II. The Biscari Massacre is one of the most known war crimes committed by Allied troops in World War II. It took place on July 14, 1943, during the invasion of Sicily. 2 soldiers of the 180th Infantry Regiment, 45th Infantry Division, were held responsible for the murder of 71 Italians and 2 German prisoners of war. On July 10, 1943, troops of Lieutenant General Patton's 7th Army and troops from the British 8th Army under General Montgomery landed on the Italian island of Sicily. For soldiers of the 180th Infantry Regiment, this was the first engagement ever. This unit was formed out of National Guard units from Colorado, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona. These men were the only Green Division participating in the invasion. Aware of their lack of combat experience, Lieutenant General Patton decided to give them a little spur. On July 9th, the day before the invasion, Patton held a speech in which he urged soldiers to be merciless. "When we land against the enemy, don't forget to hit him, and hit him hard. When we meet the enemy, we will kill him. We will show him no mercy. He has killed thousands of your comrades, and he must die. If your company officers in leading your men against the enemy find him shooting at you, and when you get within 200 yards of him, he wishes to surrender, oh no, that will die. You will kill him. Stick him between the 3rd and 4th ribs." Lieutenant General Patton later stated that he wanted to turn these unskilled young boys into killing machines so that they could bear the difficulties of combat better. He probably had no idea what kind of problem his speech would later cause. Even though the first days of the invasion showed only weak resistance of Axis units, soldiers of the 180th Infantry Regiment performed poorly. It was obvious at that point that the campaign would be difficult for them and battle fatigue from constant combat was setting in. It was their misfortune that they were ordered to capture the Biscari airport. It turned out that the mission would be complicated for the inexperienced unit. They suffered heavy casualties from the enemy's artillery, mortar, and sniper fire. The enemy snipers were especially effective from concealed positions. This fierce resistance frustrated the American soldiers so much that they took their anger out on those who surrendered. The first POW incident happened at the operational zone of the A Company. As the company was pushing towards the airport, they managed to capture 45 Italian and 3 German soldiers. Major Roger Denham from the 1st Battalion ordered Sergeant Horace T. West, 33 years old, to take these prisoners down the road where they would be held for questioning. The POWs had been told to take their shoes off in order to prevent them from escaping. Sergeant West obeyed the order and marched the prisoners in the company and a few other soldiers. After they went a mile down the road, Sergeant West set aside several prisoners and sent them to the intelligence officer. The rest he ordered to line up. He then took a Thompson submachine gun from one of his soldiers and sprayed all the prisoners with gunfire. After he emptied the entire magazine, he reloaded and shot lying down prisoners at point-blank range in the chest. 35 Italian and 2 German soldiers were killed. The following day, the chaplain, Lieutenant Colonel William E. King, discovered the bodies and reported it to his senior officers. The second incident took place on the other side of the airport 3 hours later. Over there, C Company was being torn apart by mortar fire and snipers. Once they managed to secure the position from which they were being sniped at, the American soldiers captured 35 to 40 Italian soldiers who had surrendered, some dressed in civilian clothing. An interpreter asked them if they were acting as snipers, but got no response. Company Commander Captain John Compton, believing that they were responsible for the sniper fire, ordered his men to shoot them on the spot. 11 of his soldiers obeyed the order and lined up the captured Italians. Some of the prisoners who realized what was going to happen started to run, at which moment the American soldiers opened fire. All of the Italian prisoners of war were killed. It didn't take long for Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of the 2nd Corps to which the 180th Regiment belonged, to find out about both incidents. He reported it to Lieutenant General Patton, who dismissed the accusations as an exaggeration. He also suggested the whole thing to be covered up so it wouldn't disturb the press. Bradley, however, insisted on conducting the investigation and that both West and Compton should be tried for murder. Patton eventually gave in and both were arrested and put on trial. In the trial, both men pleaded not guilty since, as they stated, they were acting under Lieutenant General Patton's orders given during a speech before the invasion. However, such a defense was not applicable in both cases. Sergeant West was accused of executing prisoners of war who had already surrendered, and that he did it in cold blood. It was pointed out that he had taken another magazine to shoot them again. For his crime, Sergeant West was sentenced to life imprisonment. His good service was the only thing that saved his life. The investigations ended abruptly in 1944 at the fear that the incident might have leaked to the U.S. public and the fear of repercussions on U.S. POWs in Axis hands. On the 23rd of November 1944, West was released from prison and reactivated to the rank of private. After the war, he was honorably discharged. Captain Compton, on the other hand, was acquitted and resigned to another unit. He was killed in action on November 8, 1943. The trial only dealt with 2 cases that totaled almost 80 victims. The exact number of those killed is unknown, as other incidents at Biscari were not brought to court. Both records of the trial were classified as secret and kept far from the eyes of the public for years. George H.W. Bush, the president who avoided being eaten by cannibals in World War II. George Herbert Walker Bush was the last U.S. president that served in combat. There were a number of his predecessors who also paid their debt to the country, but George Bush's experience was completely unique. He managed to evade the gruesome death of being eaten by Japanese soldiers. When the Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, George Bush was only a 17-year-old teenager. He was attending the last year of the Phillips Academy University Preparatory School in Andover, Massachusetts. In the days after the attack, the people of the United States experienced a rush of patriotism. It was the same case with young Bush, who wanted to enlist as soon as possible so he could serve his country. Since he was still underage, his first idea was to enlist in Canada, but he changed his mind due to his strong wish to serve as an aviator in the U.S. Navy. As soon as he graduated and turned 18 on June 13, 1942, George Bush signed up for the U.S. Naval Reserves. 1 year after he joined the Navy, he was commissioned as an ensign. Many believed at the time that he was the youngest pilot in the U.S. Navy, as he was only 19 years old. It didn't take long when in the spring of 1944 he was sent as a pilot to the USS San Jacinto light aircraft carrier. He arrived just in time to participate in the campaign of island hopping against Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. Still a youngster, George Bush became an experienced pilot after fighting over Marcus and Wake Island. He also participated in one of the largest air combats in the war, the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. In the final day of the battle, after returning from the mission, Bush had to make a forced landing on the water. It was his first crash in the war. Luckily, he and his crew were rescued by the destroyer USS Clarence K. Bronson. The second one, however, was far more dramatic. As American forces were rolling northwards on the Pacific, they commenced a campaign on the Bonin Islands in August 1944. It was the same month when George H.W. Bush was promoted to Lieutenant Junior. On September 2nd, Bush received an order to fly in a group with 3 other bombers towards the island of Chichijima. Their mission was to destroy a very important radio tower that was located on the island. As soon as they appeared in the skies over the island, they were attacked by the strong anti-aircraft defense. Bush's plane was hit at the moment when he started to dive towards the target. Neglecting the fact that his plane was on fire and the entire cockpit was full of smoke, Bush continued to dive until he realized the bombs had hit and damaged the radio tower. It was only then that he turned his blazing plane towards the USS San Jacinto. Once they were far enough from the island, Bush and 2 other crew members bailed out of the plane. As he was descending, Bush observed his plane hitting the water and disappear into the waves. Moments after, as he hit the water, his struggle began. With a heavy, soaked flight suit, wounded head, and eyes still burning from the smoke in the cockpit, Bush had to fight to stay on top of the water. His fortune was that he landed in the vicinity of a life raft. When he got a hold of it, he inflated it and climbed aboard. The misfortune was that the winds were pushing him closer towards the Japanese-held island, so Bush had to paddle with his arms to stay as far away as possible. At one point, he was spotted by the Japanese, who sent boats to capture him. but these were repelled by American fighter planes. For 4 hours, George was floating in his raft as fighter aircraft were flying above his head to protect him. Finally, he was rescued by the lifeguard submarine, USS Finback. Several other airmen were shot down and also escaped by bailing out, but they would not be so lucky. Those 8 aviators who were captured suffered severe torture from the Japanese squad on the island. They were either beaten or stabbed with sharp bamboo sticks, after which they were killed. The most horrifying part was that the bodies of 4 of them were used to prepare a meal for the Japanese officers. By the wish of Major Sueo Matoba, Japanese surgeon Dr. Teraki removed the liver from one of the dead U.S. pilots and handed it over to the cook. He then prepared it with soy sauce and vegetables and served it in small pieces pierced with bamboo sticks. Major Matoba, in the company of other officers, and commander of the island General Yoshio Tachibana, feasted on this gruesome meal with sake. They believed it was good medicine for the stomach. The same feast was repeated with the body parts of 3 of the other aviators. At the time, Bush knew nothing about this crime that was kept secret, even though the executors were eventually trialed in 1946. It was not until 2003, in the study published in the book Flyboys, A True Story of Courage, that George H.W. Bush and the entire public learned of the terrible destiny of the captured airmen. In November 1944, Bush returned to the USS San Jacinto and continued to fight over the Philippines. After a few months, his entire unit returned to the States due to heavy casualties. And in September 1945, George H.W. Bush was honorably discharged from duty. Even though he flew 58 combat missions, had 126 carrier landings, and 1,228 flight hours, the mission over the island of Chichijima was one that earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross. As he later claimed, these were the moments that he remembered for the rest of his life. The Baton Death March, April 1942, World War II. During the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Second World War, the Imperial Japanese Army committed a series of war crimes in territories they occupied in China, Burma, and Southeast Asia. These crimes resulted in the millions of deaths of civilians and prisoners of war. The Baton Death March was one such atrocity. After the surrender of joint U.S.-Filipino forces at the Baton Peninsula in the Philippines on April 9th of 1942, the Japanese forced 76,000 prisoners of war to march to the Camp O'Donnell prison camp. Accounts of the total distance of the march vary, but it was approximately 66 miles, or 106 kilometers, on foot. During the march that lasted from 5 to 10 days, depending on when the prisoner joined, the Allied prisoners of war suffered inhumane conditions and severe maltreatment from the Japanese soldiers. Many of them would never reach the final destination. Immediately after the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese commenced a campaign of seizing the Philippine Islands, the most important geostrategic position for the control of Southeast Asia. The main Japanese troops had already landed on the island of Luzon on December 10th, but the main attack began on December 22nd, 1941. The Philippine archipelago was defended by no more than 150,000 troops from the U.S. and Filipino armies under the command of American General Douglas MacArthur. However, he didn't have command of the Navy. As General MacArthur prepared for the defense of the islands, he abandoned the previously made defense scenario, War Plan Orange, or WPO-3, which concentrated troops at Manila Bay and deployed troops along the entire archipelago coast. It was a costly mistake that allowed the Japanese 14th Army to capture most of the country by the end of December. Facing defeat, General MacArthur switched back to Plan WPO-3, but it was too late. The remaining defenders withdrew to the area of the Baton Peninsula that extended into Manila Bay, and the Battle of Baton began the first week of January 1942. Unlike the rest of the island, the Baton defenders showed fierce resistance, but it wasn't enough. The defense was prepared hastily and they were extremely low on supplies and ammunition. Their defeat was imminent. On March 11, 1942, General Douglas MacArthur left Manila at the direct order of U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt. He promised his troops, "I shall return," and repeated this promise afterwards in many speeches. The soldiers at Baton, called the Battling Bastards of Baton, held out for one more month. Their name was immortalized in the limerick written by American war correspondent Frank Hewlett. "We're the Battling Bastards of Baton. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam. No aunts, no uncles, no cousins, no nieces. No pills, no planes, no artillery pieces. And nobody gives a damn. On April 9th, after 3 months of fierce combat in the most difficult conditions, the Battle of Baton was over. Soldiers from both the Philippine Army and the U.S. Army surrendered to the Japanese forces. However grueling their efforts were in defending Baton, it would be nothing compared to the agony that they were about to suffer as Japanese prisoners of war. The Japanese army had expected to conquer the Philippines in just a few days, but the amount of soldiers that they captured far exceeded their expectations. They had expected to capture around 30,000 prisoners, but the reality was that 76,000 American and Filipino soldiers had laid down their arms. It became a tremendous logistical problem for the Japanese, who were able to provide neither transport nor food for such a large number of prisoners. Besides this, the Japanese army in general suffered from a shortage of motor transport. During surrender discussions, U.S. Major General Edward King asked for permission to drive the POWs to Camp O'Donnell in American Army trucks, but Japanese General Masaharu Homa dismissed this request. Eventually, it was decided that the prisoners would march on foot to the O'Donnell camp. The prisoners were gathered at the municipality of Mariveles, where the march started. The route went along the coast of Manila Bay to the town of Lubao, and then to the San Fernando train station. From there, the plan was to transport the prisoners by railway to Capas, and then on foot an additional 8 to 10 miles, or about 14 kilometers, to Camp O'Donnell. At the moment of their surrender, the U.S. and Filipino soldiers were already exhausted by the arduous combat with the Japanese troops. They were also suffering from malnutrition because of their reduced food rations during the final stages of the Battle of Baton. For the men already in such a bad state, the 66-mile march was sheer torture. The Japanese forced them to march 25 miles per day, which was the average marching speed for the Japanese soldiers. Even in the best of conditions, the American soldiers normally marched only 15 to 20 miles per day. Contrary to what was planned, the caravan moved slowly, as at times they had to make way for the Japanese troops moving southwards. The march lasted for days. While the first contingent of prisoners finished the march in 5 days, the last of them arrived at the camp after 10 days. During the entire length of the march, the prisoners were exposed to direct sunlight and tropical temperatures of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, making them feel even more exhausted. The fact that they were denied food and water only made the journey more agonizing. Faced with a substantial number of POWs, the Japanese did not have enough food or supplies for them all. As the Japanese soldiers were the priority for receiving food rations, the prisoners only received 1 meal during the entire march, if they were lucky to receive food at all. Most prisoners had their first meal only when they arrived at the prison camp. What was worse than the hunger was the lack of drinking water, which the Japanese guards intentionally deprived the prisoners of. A lot of soldiers went mad from thirst and ended up being shot by Japanese guards. Others were so desperate that they drank the water from wallow pits and ditches that were filled with animal waste. The polluted water caused dysentery, which in most cases had fatal consequences. After only 2 days, the lack of food and water had taken its toll, as many soldiers were so exhausted they couldn't continue the march. All those who were not able to continue the march faced execution by a group of Japanese soldiers that had trailed the procession. The Americans called these groups buzzard squads. Many of those who survived the thirst and hunger did so thanks to the bravery of local Filipinos. They secretly threw sugar cane and canteens of water along the way so that prisoners could pick them up and get some measure of sustenance. The Japanese guards made the march agony for the prisoners. During the entire journey, they forced the prisoners to march at a steady pace, disregarding the fact that most of them were physically unable to do so. All of those who were lagging behind were encouraged to continue with bayonets. However, the Japanese guards wasted no time with the POWs, who showed the lack of strength to continue. They simply killed them and left them on the road. Their entire route was filled with the bodies of dead prisoners. This horrifying image was worsened by the fact that many of the prisoners were mangled by vehicles as the Japanese ran over them. The American and Filipino prisoners were completely stripped of their dignity. They faced constant abuse and beatings. For no reason, the Japanese guards would slap, kick, or hit prisoners with the buttstocks of their rifles. Often, prisoners were beaten for disobeying orders from the Japanese guards, when the prisoners didn't understand what they were being asked to do. Those that tried to escape were shot or beheaded. Prisoners who were too exhausted to wake up were buried alive in graves. A deeper reason for the maltreatment lay in the Japanese belief that Americans and Filipinos were less worthy nations. On top of that, the Japanese were furious at their enemies for the resistance they showed in the Battle of Baton. The Japanese guards were pushed by this intense hatred in treating their enemies with merciless cruelty. The prisoners were forced to march until most of them collapsed. Bathroom breaks were infrequent, so soldiers either had to hold it or urinate and defecate into their trousers. This caused infections to the wounds on their legs from the brutal marching. Breaks were only made for Japanese guards to rest. Even in these few cases, the prisoners were not allowed to sit down. Anyone who disobeyed would have been shot immediately. To make things worse for the prisoners, the Japanese made stops by artesian wells without allowing them to quench their thirst. Once they arrived at San Fernando, they transported the prisoners by railway to the town of Capas, not far from Camp O'Donnell. It seemed like a moment of relief, but it was another stage to their suffering. The prisoners were packed into old metal boxcars that had no openings or any kind of ventilation. They were crammed in so tightly that it was impossible to sit down. If anyone passed out or died from exhaustion, he would not be able to fall over. The train traveled without making any stops. The prisoners that needed to relieve themselves had to do it right there in the boxcar, and they were still without food or water. After finally reaching Capas, the prisoners walked for another 8 to 10 miles to Camp O'Donnell. In the camp, they received a single ball of rice as a meal. For most of the prisoners, it was their first meal since they began the march. The only relief was that they were finally able to lie down and rest their feet, though many of their comrades did not live to see this happen. In the days to come, many continued to die because of the inhumane conditions of the camp, some of these from the exhaustion and dysentery they had caught along the way. Estimates are that approximately 650 American soldiers and between 5,000 to 18,000 Filipino soldiers died during the march. After the war, captured General Masaharu Homa, commander of the Japanese 14th Army, was put to trial for war crimes and sentenced to death in 1946. Masanobu Tsuji, a Japanese officer who ordered the killing of prisoners, avoided justice and even served as a member of the post-war Japanese parliament. The Baton Death March was one of the worst war crimes of the entire war in the Pacific. Its horrors are truly a perfect example of why historians have named the Second World War the War Without Mercy. The Mystery of Yamashitas Gold, 1944 to 1945. Throughout history, there have been many stories of lost, priceless treasures, like the chalice drunken by Christ at the Last Supper, that's said to be hidden somewhere in Glastonbury in Somerset, England. There's also a tale of a fabled city in South America called El Dorado that was said to be made of gold and contain precious gemstones in unbelievable quantities. Yet despite many expeditions to the region, it has yet to be found. Then there's the tale of a lost wagon train in medieval England. It was rumored to contain an enormous haul of gold collected by the tyrannical King John in taxation. It's estimated to be worth billions of dollars in today's value. The story goes that it was lost on the shores of Norfolk during a particularly violent storm. Supposedly, it was washed into the sea, and to this day the treasure has never been seen again. Though some say it was all just a scam in order for the king to get out of paying a fortune he owed to some very powerful barons. In more recent times, in the later half of the 20th century, there were various stories of lost Nazi gold. There was even an unsubstantiated claim that the Vatican Bank was hiding some of this looted treasure. And then there's the intriguing World War II mystery that is commonly referred to as Yamashitas Gold. It was claimed that the Japanese authorities, in conjunction with the Yakuza gangsters, allegedly looted a vast amount of valuables on a massive scale from the then-occupied territories towards the end of the war. It was intended for this loot to fund the Japanese war effort. Imperial Japan's own gold reserves had shrunk dramatically, paying for its military. This secret operation, named Kin no Yuri, or the Golden Lily, was thought to have been masterminded by the legendary Imperial Japanese Army General Tomoyuki Yamashita, and it's rumored that Prince Yasuhito Chichibu oversaw the organization. Yamashita was a very well-respected general with a fearsome reputation, being known as the Tiger of Malaya. He was a highly decorated officer, having been awarded Japan's highest military honors, that of the Order of the Rising Sun, as well as the revered Order of the Golden Kite. Yamashita's brilliance was even recognized by Nazi Germany, who awarded him the prestigious Order of the German Eagle for his outstanding leadership against the Allies. Significantly, he had presided over the worst military defeat the British forces had ever suffered. This was when a significantly smaller Japanese force had overwhelmed the British garrison at Singapore in 1942, capturing over 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops in doing so. By the following year, Yamashita had fallen out of favor with the Japanese Prime Minister, Hideki Tojo, who he had clashed with often over various political issues. So he ended up being transferred to the isolated and remote northern state of Manchuria, where he spent the next 2 years languishing in obscurity. Until September 1944, he was called back to run the defense of the Japanese-held Philippines. It was said he also took over a covert operation that had been running since 1943 of stockpiling looted valuables in the Philippines. These had come from foreign banks, museums, temples, and churches located in Japanese-occupied territories like Hong Kong, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, and parts of China. By now, it's said that the Japanese had amassed a huge fortune and it was storing it at Fort Santiago in Manila, the Filipino capital. But their plan to ship it all back to mainland Japan had become impossible, as U.S. submarines and aircraft now dominated all the shipping lanes out of the Philippines. Then the situation became even more dire, as over the next few months the U.S. launched a number of successful large-scale amphibious operations that captured a series of key cities in the Philippines. All these disasters forced Yamashita to disperse this gigantic haul of treasure across the Philippines in remote mines and caves. In order to make this possible, Allied prisoners were used to dig the intricate tunnel systems, and once the gold was safely stashed away, they were executed and buried along with the treasure. It is also said that Japanese officers even had their own engineers killed as well, to protect the secret locations of the gold. These highly secret locations were said to have contained elaborate booby traps consisting of such things as landmines, poison gas, and hidden pits full of sharpened bamboo sticks. It is said that there are over 170 locations, totaling over $100 billion in today's value. Yamashita retreated with his main force out of Manila and into the neighboring mountains. But against his orders, a large force of naval marines took it upon themselves to reoccupy the capital in an attempt to destroy all the port facilities and naval storehouses in the city that were all still relatively intact. What followed between February 3rd and March 3rd, 1945, was 4 weeks of fierce street-to-street fighting that resulted in a large part of the city being burnt down. The Japanese Marines during this time carried out some of the worst atrocities of the entire war. Going on a rampage, they carried out numerous mass shootings, beheadings, bayoneting, and the burning alive of unarmed civilians, many of whom were women and children. When the U.S. finally liberated the city, over 100,000 Filipino civilians had been massacred by the Japanese defenders. Yamashita and his remaining forces continued fighting throughout the summer, carrying out what was essentially a guerrilla warfare campaign. They finally surrendered in September, several weeks after the official surrender of Japan. Within a couple of months of being captured, General Yamashita was put on trial for war crimes regarding the slaughter of civilians during what had become known as the Battle of Manila. He was quickly found guilty, and just moments before he was executed on February 23, 1946, he gave a speech thanking the U.S. military for all their kindness and fair treatment he had received from them throughout his trial. He was then hanged. By the end of the war, the Japanese who knew the locations of the gold were all but killed in action or had been executed for war crimes. Many years later, the most famous man to have claimed to have found a portion of the treasure Yamashita is said to have hidden made his discovery. His name was Rogelio Roxas, a former locksmith turned amateur treasure hunter in 1970. With information and a map he had received from Japanese informants with connections to Yamashita, Roxas claimed to have found a large golden Buddha statue and other valuable gold treasures buried deep in underground tunnels. Inside were also bayonets, katanas, radios, and the skeletons of Japanese soldiers still in uniform. He further claimed that the then dictator of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos, swiftly confiscated all of this treasure and imprisoned him where he was tortured. Although Roxas escaped prison, as long as Marcos was in power, he had no chance of recovering this treasure. When Marcos was deposed in 1986 and went into exile in Hawaii, Roxas sued him 2 years later and won his case, but the supposed treasure was never recovered.
The Hanoi Hilton, Hua Lao Prison, Hanoi, the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, around 2,500 American soldiers were reported as being prisoners of war or missing in action. When the war ended for the United States in 1973, only 591 of them returned home. The rest remained in prison camps across North and South Vietnam. The majority of American POWs were captured by the North Vietnamese Army. They spent their captivity in some of the 13 POW camps in the country. The most notorious of these was the Hua Lao prison, located in Hanoi. It was generally referred to by its inmates as the Hanoi Hilton. Prison conditions. The prison was built by the French in the late 19th century to house political prisoners who were supporters of Vietnamese independence from their French colonial rulers. In 1954, when the French left the country, the prison was converted into a communist education center. It didn't last long, however, before Hua Lao became a prison once again when the Vietnam War started. It soon became an exclusive prison for American POWs. The first U.S. prisoner to arrive at Hua Lao was Lieutenant Everett Alvarez Jr. He had been shot down in his Douglas A-4 Skyhawk dive bomber in August 1964 during Operation Pierce Arrow. Soon, other American POWs began arriving. Most of them were pilots who had been shot down over North Vietnam. One of the most famous inmates was a pilot named John McCain, who went on to become a U.S. Senator and a presidential candidate. He too had to eject from his A-4 Skyhawk dive bomber in 1967 when it was hit by a missile and crash-landed into Truc Bac Lake in Hanoi. He was rescued from drowning by some locals, but despite having a broken leg and 2 fractured arms caused by the ejection, he was punched and kicked by the mob, and even had a bayonet thrust into his foot, before being taken to a local military hospital for medical treatment and then transferred to the Hua Lao prison. The Hanoi Hilton was actually a prison complex in the center of Hanoi. It consisted of a number of prison wings or sectors, joined together by a central courtyard. Like the prison itself, these sectors had ironic nicknames, such as New Guy Village, Heartbreak Hotel, Little Vegas, Camp Unity, and some others. Cell blocks were on the ground floor buildings with 16-inch brick walls and red tiles on the roof. Each prison building had numerous cells inside. The typical cell housed 4 prisoners and would have been large enough to house bunk beds made of wooden boards on either side of the doorway. Each bed was fitted with iron leg stocks or shackles and resembled more of a torture device than a bed. Prisoners were held behind heavy iron doors with peepholes that were used by the guards to control and intimidate the inmates. On the opposite wall, high up near the ceiling, was a barred window that had no cover. It stayed open all year round despite the weather. Each cell was illuminated with a small light bulb that was permanently left on. Most cells had no toilet or washing facilities, so the prisoners had to relieve themselves into small rusty buckets. On hot summer days, living in such conditions was unbearable. Hygiene in general was at the lowest level possible, and apart from the fact that the cells were extremely dirty, they were also infested with rats, cockroaches, mice, and other vermin. Prisoners had absolutely no opportunity to maintain personal hygiene. Weeks, sometimes months passed between them being allowed to even have a shower. Cells were not only filthy and humid, but were utterly depressing. Drawings and inscriptions scribbled by the inmates on the walls just intensified the hopelessness of life in the Hanoi Hilton. Everyday life. Hua Lao Prison earned its ironic nickname after the famous hotel chain solely for the reason of its ultimate inhospitability. The harsh conditions of the living space in prison were deemed suitable for the American POWs, as the North Vietnamese government designated them as normal criminals and treated them accordingly. There were strict camp regulations on how the prisoners should behave and what their rights and duties were. First of all, the prisoners were obliged to obey every order without question. Any attempt to refuse to answer a question resulted in severe punishment. Prisoners were even punished if they refused to eat their rations. On the other hand, prisoners had to pay the utmost respect to their guards and officers in the camp. Any talking among the prisoners was also strictly forbidden. Instead, they were welcome to enjoy regular propaganda brainwashing through box speakers. Each night, the radio program of the famous Hanoi Hannah ended with a message. GIs, why should you die thousands of miles from home? Lay down your arms now and cross over to the people's side. The food that the POWs were given was just something else that made their lives miserable. The average meal for a POW in the Hanoi Hilton was a bowl of greasy vegetable soup and a cup of rice. The only thing that ever changed was the vegetables used. It was either pumpkin, cabbage, or a strange vegetable called the sewer greens by the POWs. The diet, lacking any proper protein or energy, caused serious health problems to the prisoners. Almost all of them suffered from a vitamin deficiency and lost about 20% of their body mass. The lack of proper food was a real hardship in the winter months. With a low energy intake, the prisoners were unable to warm their bodies, and with the cell windows open all year long, many of them struggled to survive the cold. Tap code. Although communication among the prisoners was strictly forbidden, maintaining contact among themselves was still vital. It allowed them to receive information from the outside world from new inmates, learn about different interrogation tortures, and share their experiences. Most importantly, they were able to encourage each other and build a level of morale as well as a sense of unity. Despite the horrors they endured, the American POWs in the Hanoi Hilton didn't lack ingenuity. Instead of verbal communication, they designed a special tap code for passing on messages. Tap code was similar to Morse code and used a 5x5 matrix of the alphabet and was physically banged out on walls or metal doors in the cells. Letters were identified by two sets of taps, one for the column and the other for the row. Prisoners standardized abbreviations in order to ease communication via the tap code. There was even a simple system for encrypting messages. It was a perfect way of communication of which the North Vietnamese guards were completely unaware was going on. Torture. Life in the Hanoi Hilton was bad enough as it was, but prisoners were constantly exposed to torture. They could be tortured for several reasons: to impart information, to be forced to cooperate, or just purely for the guards' entertainment. Most tortures were held during the interrogations. The first level was psychological torture. Prisoners were exposed to isolation, starvation, sleep denial, and constant brainwashing sessions. After only a few days of such treatment, their ability to resist further interrogation decreased significantly. The American POWs usually managed to withstand this kind of torture, much to the fury of their interrogators, who would then resort to the physical torture. The basic kind of physical torture was simple but brutal, with the beating of prisoners while they were tied to stools. This was, unfortunately, only a prelude to even worse torture. The NVA guards and interrogators were quite creative in their torturing techniques. Prisoners were blindfolded and forced to run around the courtyard while being dragged along by a noose. They would then be thrown into trenches or small cages where they would spend several days in cramped positions. There were, however, two torturing methods that were considered much worse. The first was a rope trick, a torture that involved binding a prisoner's arms behind their back, which would then rotate upward until their shoulders popped out of their sockets. In this position, the prisoners were hung from meat hooks secured to the ceiling. There was a variation of this method that involved tying both hands and feet together and then binding the hands to the ankles behind the back. To make the method even worse, while hanging from the ceiling, some prisoners were often brutally beaten with sticks. The second method was the twisted cuff treatment. Prisoners had their arms tied behind their backs with handcuffs that had a ratchet attached. The cuffs were then tightened to a degree where two bones bent together as one. There were examples where both of these sadistic methods were used together. Unfortunately for the American prisoners, torture didn't stop with the interrogations. Even during their stay in the cells, POWs were exposed to abuse by having their legs placed in iron shackles at the bottom of the bed. In addition, iron pipes were installed to put pressure on the shins. Prisoners lay in such positions with their hands tied behind their back for days on end. All that time, they had to defecate where they lay, and this would attract the rats and cockroaches that would crawl all over their bodies. On top of everything, the lack of medical care after the torture was also a kind of maltreatment, especially because the guards enjoyed picking at the prisoners' wounds. The worst period for torturing was after the failed escape plan in the spring of 1969. However, it all stopped in September, the same year that Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh died. It was practically impossible for any prisoners to withstand this continuous torture and abuse, and eventually each of them reached his breaking point. The interrogators would manage to extort some kind of information or confession from them. However, prisoners had their own way of manipulating their interrogators. Many of the coerced confessions were made up and full of nonsense. One such confession came from an airman who promised to not fly any further missions against the North Vietnamese. He called himself Lieutenant Clark Kent, who was, of course, better known to the American public as Superman, the comic book hero. Life in the Hanoi Hilton prison produced extreme physical, mental, and emotional stress for its POWs. It was especially difficult for those who had spent years inside the prison. The record was held by Lieutenant Everett Alvarez Jr., the first American POW to come to the Hanoi Hilton. He had spent 8 years and 7 months in captivity. He was released on February 12, 1973, with the first batch of American POWs that returned home as part of Operation Homecoming. The last POW left in March 1973. In the years to follow, former prisoners shared their experiences with the American and international public with the horrors they suffered at the Hanoi Hilton. The United States government never charged the North Vietnamese for the war crimes they committed.